This week on the Wheelhouse. The S word. What exactly is socialism and what isn't it? For Connecticut Public, I'm Frankie Graziano. This is the Wheelhouse. It's a show that connects politics to the people. We got your weekly dose of politics in Connecticut and beyond right here. This hour, we're going to talk about socialism. Today, more and more politicians have dubbed themselves Democratic Socialists. Politicians like United States Senator Bernie Sanders, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and the Democratic candidate for mayor of New York City, Zoran Mamdani. But what exactly is a Democratic Socialist? Is it different from a traditional socialist? Joining me now, Christopher Viles, a professor of English and American Studies at the University of Connecticut. Christopher, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
Great to have you on. Hey, let's begin this conversation by breaking down what socialism is and what it isn't. I'll also invite folks to give us a call, 888-720-9677 if you want to speak with us this morning, 888-720-9677. I mentioned Zoran Mamdani earlier. He's a candidate for New York City mayor, and he's a big reason why we're talking about this today. Identifying as a Democratic Socialist, President Trump has taken aim at his politics and called him another name. And we have a clip that we're going to
I'd prefer not to have a communist mayor of New York City. And, you know, that's what he is based on his policy. If you look at his statements in the past, I would like to see two people drop out and have it be one-on-one. And I think that's a race that could be won.
So there we hear President Trump sort of conflating socialism maybe with communism. Is democratic socialism the same thing as communism?
No, not at all. And first of all, and to your earlier question, like what is socialism? Socialism, keep in mind, is something that's been around really since the first socialist movements were in France in the 1830s. So you're talking about a word and a movement that's been in virtually all countries of the world, at one point or another for the last 200 years almost, right? So there's not one single meaning, but one thing is clear is communism is pretty specifically an authoritarian form of socialism. And it tends to the only places that it's really taken power successfully, the only successful communist revolutions are in places without long traditions of liberal democracy, right? And democratic socialism, that's more of a tradition that comes out of Western Europe for the most part in the late 19th century to the present, extending through social democracy, where really is trying to achieve something like a socialist or socialist light economy through the ballot box rather than through kind of a violent seizure of power.
Is there a way that democratic socialism, or at least the way that a Democrat that calls themselves a democratic socialist, would look at itself differently than socialism?
I'm not really, with the biggest organization in the United States right now for socialism is the Democratic Socialists of America, the DSA, and they've got branches in Connecticut as well. And so, I think depending on who you ask in that movement, you'd probably get very different answers, right? But I think what they're trying to do is really position themselves against authoritarian communism by that label. I think they're aware that a lot of Americans associate socialism with authoritarianism. So they're trying to basically say that, look, we actually are doing this through the ballot box, through legal means. But I really do think that they come out of a tradition dating to the late 19th century in Europe and also the United States of actually seeing yourself, trying to get socialist means through the ballot box.
A better way to ask that question might be like, what are the core tenets of a democratic socialist society? You're saying obviously different from authoritarianism, or at least trying to be. So help us understand what it might look like.
Well, yeah. Again, the DSA, which is not the only socialist organization in America, they debate this internally, and I don't think there's 100% agreement. But I think what is very clear is that they're trying to kind of, they would want a society with much less kind of inequality, between rich and poor. Some would say almost no inequality, but certainly much less, with a Green New Deal, a more socially oriented economy, with kind of less kind of coercive policing, less prisons. Also, depending on who you ask, probably certain sectors of the economy actually owned by the state, maybe the oil companies, things like that, certain kind of selective nationalizations. So you, again, would be looking at a more kind of socially kind of oriented, less, maybe not the market. In most versions of democratic socialism, there's a space for the free market, especially small businesses, et cetera, but less control by kind of big business, I think was what they would kind of want to see.
You told me that the model for this might be in the late 19th century. Excuse me, I'm thinking about a different form of socialism, but just help me understand the socialist movement. You talked about the model in the past. Where might we see democratic socialism playing out today outside of the DSA here in America?
You mean like in the United States?
Outside of America. So like
okay, outside of the United States.
Perhaps
so there are
yes, go ahead. Is it in Europe, in some parts of Europe?
Well, and keeping in mind, too, is that after World War II, the kind of center of gravity for socialism really kind of goes outside of Europe into the global south, to Latin America, Africa, Asia, et cetera, right? And there are still, to be clear, authoritarian versions of socialism or communism. Venezuela, a big example, Nicaragua, also China, Vietnam, right? So the authoritarian variants are still there, right?
Yeah.
But there's this kind of dual tradition of, a more democratic version that's being kind of pushed, within spaces that tend to have more of a tradition of liberal democracy.
And would we find that maybe in like some of the Nordic countries, like in Scandinavia, or where would we find that?
Yeah, absolutely.
And how's it going for them as well?
Yeah. I mean, it's for example, I mean, it's hard to parse out in certain ways because if you ask somebody at the Cato Institute, the libertarians, they're going to just see all parties of Western Europe and Northern Europe.
We do love that kind of. I know it's in the weeds, but we do like that kind of nuance here on the Wheelhouse. So go ahead.
Yeah. But basically, if you're going to actually look at those countries, there's kind of a mainstreaming of what we would see as a kind of a social democratic idea, right? A more kind of market-oriented economy that really kind of becomes a third rail in politics, much like here, where there's certain things like Social Security that began as a socialist idea that really is, a kind of a third rail that all parties embrace. I think there's certain kind of basic socialist features of the economy that all parties in, Western Europe and Northern Europe embrace, especially Northern Europe, right? And so, and I lived in Germany for a time too, where you have, still a significant part of the state is under, government auspices, so much so that at universities becoming like basically a Verwaltungswissenschaft, which is an administrative science, is as popular as a major as, business administration, right? Because there's so many people going into the state sector.
Extra points for that perfect pronunciation of that German word. Let's take it to some of the modern day politicians in the United States. We have United States Senator Bernie Sanders, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. You mentioned the Green New Deal. She's essentially an architect of that. And Democratic candidate for mayor of New York City, Zoran Mamdani. They joined forces back in September for a fighting oligarchy rally. Fundamentally, what are some of like the through lines that connect these folks together, and what are they against?
Okay, I mean, I think what they are against for certain is a kind of a laissez-faire economy, right? Economy that is absolutely what we sometimes now call neoliberalism, right? Which is a kind of a free market on steroids. I think, again, in the tradition of democratic socialism, mostly these folks are kind of practical politicians, right? And so they're pushing for things in the immediate short term that they think are kind of doable, like the Green New Deal, like a different tax structure, a kind of a liberalism plus, right? Is a kind of and I saw there was a recent interview with Zoran Mamdani on by the New Yorker, and he was asked, "What do you see as socialism?" And his answer was interesting, which was that socialism is that no one is priced out of housing or food or the basic necessities, right? Which is a very general answer. It's also a very, we are dealing with people who are practical politicians who are kind of winning elections and pushing for things that they can see and possibly achieve in the next 4 to 8 years, which is very different than, somebody on the ground who's kind of pushing for a much more kind of like broad term socialist movement. So they are kind of on the kind of most mildest end of the global socialist spectrum, I would say, in terms of what they're pushing and what they're trying to achieve. Just like like less inequality rather than, I don't hear them talking about kind of massive nationalizations of industries or anything like that.
It's interesting that they're embracing socialism only because it can be seen as a taboo word in America, and particularly after we have to this is the I imagine this is a big issue that they have with socialism. Any kind of democratic socialist is anytime you try to divorce yourself from the authoritarian variant of socialism, it's almost impossible to do, right? I was asking you about socialism earlier, and we're talking about how Latin America, particularly in South America and Venezuela, they're still unable to shed sort of that other form of socialism. So this is something that I would imagine democratic socialists have to fight through all the time. So can you point us to where socialism was most taboo in our society, and sort of when it became to start to go the other way and people started to identify with it more?
Yeah. So to look at the present, for example, there's recent polling by even the Cato Institute, even and YouGov, and also Gallup, that's actually shown, around 40% of Americans have a more favorable view of socialism than capitalism. 55% prefer capitalism. So if there's a general election, capitalism would still win. But what's striking is that it's that high, that 40%. And to the Cato Institute's alarm, about 60% of young people under 30, have a favorable view of socialism, 60%, right? And that's been trending for a while. And I've certainly, working with young people, I've certainly seen that since I started teaching, a much bigger acceptance of the word. But it's funny, if you go back, in time to 1942, there was a Fortune magazine poll, right? And, polling methodologies were clearly different then. But in 1942, they found, to their alarm, in Fortune magazine, that about 25% of Americans preferred socialism over capitalism, and another 35% had an open mind to it, right? So I think what we're kind of seeing now is less of a kind of a total anomaly in American history and more a returning back to a pre-World War II normal almost, right? I think the point in American history where socialism was the biggest taboo was really during the Cold War, right? After World War II, after the kind of the competition with the Soviet Union. And I think with the baby boomer generation too, that word was the biggest anathema for the most part, or at least most of them, right? So, but I think to their parents, it was mixed, right? To the baby boomers' parents. So I think we're kind of returning back to a 20th century norm in certain ways about where the needle is pointing. And I think for also socialism, when we're talking about the increasing popularity to that, that's also keep in mind, I think that's the inverse of Trumpism, right? Where it's like on the right, we're seeing the right breaking taboos and norms all the time, right? And this is the kind of a less, basically a less kind of publicized thing that's happening on the left. I think what you're seeing in this country is, after, flat or declining standard of living for over a generation now at this point, people on the left and right are looking for much more kind of, dramatic sounding alternatives to the status quo, right? And but they're obviously going in very different directions with that.
Something that you said earlier about Zoran Mamdani and kind of how he's defining socialism was evocative to me of some of the students that I teach at the University of Connecticut. And obviously you teach there too. I only teach a little section for the intro students there to journalism, but they talk to me a lot about housing. So when you're talking about Zoran Mamdani explaining socialism, what it means to him, being that nobody ever gets priced out of, eating and having a meal and housing, it kind of reminds me of that. So help me understand what draws people to socialism, young people to socialism. Are there any of these kind of conversations you're having with students at UConn where they're at least, when you're thinking about class or something like that, is there any particular questions they might have if you're talking to them, or any other way you could kind of connect young people to socialism?
Yeah, I mean, I think you said it, too, and I think you might have encountered this as well. But I mean, I've seen a lot since I started teaching, to date myself, in the '90s, and and this is in other states too. I've certainly seen a shift to the left amongst younger people, and around the word socialism. That said, I haven't seen a fully developed sense of what socialism means, right? And that's that's to be understood. Not only they're young, but there is no, as I said, universally agreed upon definition of what this term means. It just means something, less kind of capitalistic. And I think the draw to it, to your question about housing and other things, is just that it seems to represent something more kind of hardcore than what the Democratic Party establishment is offering, right? And something that is actually really aimed at changing in a palpable way the standard of living and contemporary economic problems that people on the lower end of the spectrum and young people kind of are facing. I think in a general sense, that seems to be the sense I'm getting. And also the popularity, I am convinced also that the popularity of socialism, particularly amongst the young, has a lot to do also with people like Trump or Ted Cruz going on about how it's the biggest evil in the world, right? So if somebody who you see as either a joke or a monster is talking about this thing as if it's the biggest evil in the world, you're going to go, what is that? Maybe there's something to that, right? So, I mean, I think the draws are many, right?
Some of these definitions have gotten slippery at other moments in United States history. For example, I'm looking at President Roosevelt here, who held the presidency during the Great Depression, was called a communist and a socialist by critics. I recently saw an article where they said that President Donald Trump, I think it was an opinion piece, where they said and it might have been in the Atlantic or in NBC News, but it was in a popular publication where they tried to compare Trump's presidency as being the biggest socialist presidency since FDR. So are there any overlaps, maybe in terms of economic circumstances or political circumstances, between today and when Roosevelt was president back in the 30s?
Yeah, I mean, keep in mind the standard of living, when Roosevelt was there and socialism was having a real moment in the 1930s, we were talking about 25% unemployment, and also without much of a developed social service state when he first took office. So if you lose your job, you could literally starve to death and die, right? So people the crisis was much more dire. But I think right now you've got kind of a more slow generational kind of go out with a whimper, not a bang kind of economy, right? And that's just not delivering the goods for many, many. And so, I think, back then also, and there was a parallel too, is that, most of the country in the United States, at least, was kind of adopting more labor, pro-worker views. That was the majority opinion. But there was also a shift also on the other side to the radical right, to people who were also embracing literally fascism, right? This is like the Father Coughlin movement and everything like that in the 30s. So, but you have, I think, a laissez-faire economy, or an increasingly laissez-faire economy that is not delivering the goods, and people are looking for kind of radical solutions on left and right. So I think that is a kind of a general parallel, although, the depth of the crisis was far more kind of visceral back then.
From Connecticut Public Radio, this is the Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. After the break, we get a temperature check on how Americans are feeling about socialism today. Let us know how you define socialism. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. And one more thing, it's our annual Fall Fund Drive. We hope you'll consider supporting the Wheelhouse and all your favorite Connecticut public programming with a donation. Maybe you'll get something back with that donation, like our LL Bean balsam wreath, something like that. Give us a call if you'd like to support Connecticut Public, and there is more Wheelhouse on the way next. This is the Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. This hour is all about the S word, talking about socialism. We're exploring what socialism is and what it isn't, and why more Americans are warming up to the word. Still with me, Christopher Viles, the English and American Studies professor at the University of Connecticut. Thank you for joining us, Chris. And joining us now in studio, how exciting is this? Dan Haar, senior editor and columnist for CT Insider. Dan, thank you so much for joining us on the Wheelhouse.
Great to be here.
Do you identify as a Democratic Socialist? Dan Haar, no, I'm kidding. He wasn't on the camera when he did that. I thought he was. What does that mean to you? Let us know. Give us a call, 888-720-9677. If you identify as a socialist, or you don't like socialism, or you want to know more about it, give us a call. Hey, Chris, I want to talk to you in a second. I'm going to bring Dan in here because he heard some of your responses, and he'd like to put his own little spin on it. Go ahead.
Well, I would just go a little bit further and say that
as you do as a columnist,
my impression, first of all, is that there are things that Trump is doing that could perfectly well be called as much socialism as, say, Obamacare, which was called socialism, and that would be tariffs.
Tariffs.
Aren't tariffs a form of social? If we're gonna accuse things of being socialist, isn't that a form of socialism?
What aspect, Chris, would a tariff potentially be a socialism? Because I think the Intel example is one we could talk about too. But Chris, with tariffs and what aspect are you looking at in that regard, Dan? And then I want to see Chris kind of analyze that for. So,
well, you're collecting.
The aspect of, yes.
You're collecting money from a private enterprise, and you're redistributing it to the society. That's what tariffs are. It's a tax on private transactions that goes then to whatever broader purposes you want to use it for.
Can you see that parallel, Chris?
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, in the sense that tariffs were kind of the norm in the early republic of the United States up into the 19th century before World War II, right? And the late industrialization was kind of, in this country was, behind a very big tariff wall. And most of those industrialists who favored it would certainly not identify as socialists. Cato Institute would certainly tell you that, yes, tariffs are very socialist. What I do, agree with also is the notion that, I think what Trump's embrace of tariffs means is that in general, the idea of unbridled free markets is in trouble across the spectrum, where even people like Tucker Carlson and even Steve Bannon are railing against this thing, neoliberalism, right? Yeah. Which is, again, kind of laissez-faire capitalism, right? Capitalism on steroids. And so that idea of unbridled free market capitalism is certainly in trouble across the board.
But just as there's no such thing as pure form socialism in practice, there never has been this myth of the free hand of Adam Smith. Adam Smith didn't believe in or write about unbridled capitalism.
I agree, right? Like the idea of the free market, unbridled free market, has always been utopian, right? Mm-hmm. It's never been fully implemented. And even as we've retreated through neoliberalism, dialing back a lot of the kind of the New Deal state of the Cold War era, even still, a lot of that stuff from the New Deal is still in place. Social Security, minimum wage laws, child labor laws, et cetera.
Drug development.
Right. Drug development.
Hey, we got a clip that we're going to play for Chris here. This is a clip of Donald Trump back in May of 2019 at a rally in Pennsylvania. Pay attention to some of the words that he uses here, Chris.
They want to take away your health care, your health insurance. They want to take it away. Democrats are now the party of high taxes, high crime, open borders, late-term abortion, killing your Second Amendment, and radical socialism.
Some of these ideas in practice are somewhat new when you talk about reproductive rights in this way and open borders in this concept. But obviously, we're trying to figure out these ties he's making socialism in this instance is with things like no health insurance, high taxes, high crime, more. Are these policies that he listed off historically linked to socialist governance? Maybe not in the way that he's saying, but that's a hard parallel to make. But you get the idea that he's saying that maybe some of these programs, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I would say I think a lot of people in the Democratic Socialist America would love it if the Democratic Party actually represented what they saw as socialism. But open borders, no. High crime, obviously not. I'm not sure in drugs. I'm not sure if anything, or certainly taking away healthcare. I think what he's naming is the opposite of what kind of socialists are after, and I really wouldn't take that political stump speech that seriously in terms of a factual statement.
Sure, I think we were trying to give a fair shake to something that was extremely intense, at least in rhetoric. And I saw the look on your face as I was asking that question. I was like, let me switch that up a little bit. But nonetheless, I wanted to let's keep the conversation going here, Dan, because it does sort of involve that sort of link to Trump and socialism, if you will. Former Wheelhouse guest from The Atlantic, David Graham, has argued the case for Trump engaging in right-wing socialism, and his efforts to get the U.S. government in business, like with Intel, have been criticized for being socialist, particularly from people on the right.
Well, you take 10% of one company and 10% of another and 10% of a third, and pretty soon you have a power base. I think that the effects of the reaction to Trump are more important when looked at through a lens of his behavior and his authoritarianism than his policies. I think you could argue policy either way, but socialism is, and I think Chris would agree, socialism is always a reaction to monarchy.
You can't say, you can't link Donald Trump to authoritarianism. I didn't know if you know that. Well, at least in this context, we're always talking about potentially. No, I'm doing this sort of facetious in the way that I'm presenting it because we had this conversation in a pre-interview. But Dan, the point is that there's a lot of folks who toss around terms like socialism and communism. But what I'm trying to get at is they may not like when the stone's being thrown the other way, and words like fascism and authoritarianism are thrown around. Correct, Dan?
Why is it that it's okay for one side to accuse the other of being socialist, but it's not okay for the other side to accuse them, for the second side to accuse the first side of being fascist, right? If I say Trump is a fascist, that comes close to a line. And we obviously all know why it is, because fascism is associated with genocide and Hitler. And we're not making an equation between Trump and Hitler. We're making an equation between Trump and the takeover of the country. And so it's an interesting non-parallel.
It's very fascinating, that conversation, because it very quickly gets from talking about, as Dan might have used in a different way, he's talked about fascistic tendencies instead of fascism, because that seems like a nicer way to say it. But very quickly it gets from talking about potential authoritarianism, what it looks like fascism, to all of a sudden people being concerned about the parallels to Trump and Hitler. That very quickly happens that way in that regard. So that's why the conversation kind of denigrates very quickly and devolves.
I want to ask Chris if he'll go further, as I think I would, and say Mamdani himself, as the likely next mayor of New York, exists because of Trump. It's a reaction.
So Chris, I think what you said earlier was that I don't know if Chris is going to make that connection, but at least Chris said earlier that you have sort of the free market on steroids, and that's kind of pushing people. It sounds like maybe even Steve Bannon and Tucker Carlson to say that there has to be a new way, and that's kind of how these things happen. Is that where you were going with that, Chris? Kind of what Dan's saying here, that you might get a Mamdani when people aren't happy with the way that things are going.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think but I would say yes, in part, but I also think that there's been a lot of work done by sociologists and such about kind of trends amongst younger people. in this era, sometimes dubbed neoliberalism, right, where younger people are delaying marriage, they're staying at home longer, they're making kind of adult life choices, like kind of by force, kind of later in life because of student debt and all these things. So I do think that younger people are facing standard of living issues that are quite real, that kind of go beyond just a reaction to Trump, right? But that said, Trump, I think, is, part of it. Once you get like I said earlier, once you get somebody out there, saying things all the time about kind of communism is the greatest evil, right? And then it becomes a problem.
Chris, I got to try to wrap this all up in a bow within the next 90 seconds. So I'm going to take a phone call, and then I want you to respond to this person because I think they're going to talk about some of the democratic socialism we're seeing outside of the United States. And can you make this quick? Our caller, thank you so much for calling in from New Haven. Is this Caroline? Caroline, can you give us your phone call quick here as we're up against the break?
Yes, Carolyn from New Haven.
Hi, Carolyn.
Hi, thanks. I just wanted to comment on how democratic socialist policies were faring for other countries. So I'm actually a geography professor, and I was just looking at this. If you look at the United Nations Human Development Index, basically a measurement of how developed each country is. If you look at that from 1990 in the U.S. to, the most recent statistics, the United States used to be the most developed country when ranked according to its HDI. And now, Sweden, Norway, even Australia have surpassed it with higher Human Development Index. In other words, they're more developed than the United States. And that's because entirely their social democratic policies that they incorporate. It doesn't mean they're socialist countries. They're entirely democratic countries. But things like education, housing, welfare are socialized. Medicine, healthcare.
Thank you so much for bringing this up. And I'll highlight it this way. Every time I look at a child care index or something that kind of maybe even equates GDP and how people are able to afford child care or something like that, you always have Sweden as a country that's above the United States because they provide child care essentially for free. So any response to what we just heard from Carolyn there? I really appreciate the call and hearing from an academic, of course. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, no, and I can't speak to the specifics of, the Swedish economy and how it's fared. I mean, it's outside of my, wheelhouse. But at the same time, a lot of standard of living, indicators in Western Europe are much higher than in the United States, including longevity, just including how long people live, right? But I think if you want to look at kind of more socialistic economies, I think I tend to, as somebody who studies American history and American culture, tend to look at our own kind of history here, and if you look at kind of the trajectory of things, how things were going in this country in the 40s, 50s, 60s, where, you have the real wages increasing at a 3% clip every year during that period, and for working people, that's and that was a more kind of, it wasn't a socialist economy. In fact, the United States was fighting quote unquote communism during the time. But by the standards of this country's own history, things were on the up and up during that generation in ways that we haven't seen since then. Right. And that was more, and it wasn't a socialist economy, but it was more in that direction for sure.
This is the Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. We just heard from Christopher Viles, professor of English and American Studies at the University of Connecticut. Chris, thank you so much for having this conversation with us. We really appreciate your perspective.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, no problem. Dan's going to stick with me after the break. We're going to take a deeper dive into what a Democratic Socialist mayor in New York City would mean for Connecticut. That's next. You're listening to The Wheelhouse. This is The Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. This hour, we've been sifting through what's fact and what's fiction when it comes to socialism. New York City's mayoral election is only weeks away, and Democratic Socialist candidate Zoran Mamdani will face off against former Governor Andrew Cuomo, who's running as an independent. and Republican nominee Curtis Sliwa. We know him from the Guard Dogs. So what might this election mean for Connecticut's residents? I can't believe that Curtis Sliwa is still in politics. That's why I say that. Still with me, Dan Haar, senior editor and columnist for Hearst Connecticut Media. Dan, you touched on this earlier. Help me understand how a Mamdani win for New York City governor would impact economic development in the state of Connecticut.
Well, it started with an interview with Governor Lamont about a week or 10 days ago, in which he said it would hurt Connecticut because it would hurt Wall Street, the Wall Street
Did you do that
industry.
interview, or did somebody else do that?
No, that was Bloomberg.
That was Bloomberg, and then okay, so go ahead. Take
Bloomberg did the interview in Greenwich at the Economic Forum in Greenwich, importantly because the Economic Forum is a bastion of anti-socialism. That's where you have your hedge funds and your private equity folks. And so the governor duly did say that he was worried, yet he agreed with their question and said he was worried a little bit. New York City is this is him talking. New York City is the financial capital of the world, and we're a big piece of it here, as evidenced by the Economic Forum. And I want to make sure that the next mayor understands how important New York City is to that system, and that's important to Connecticut. He said nothing else about Mamdani directly, and yet that was taken as the governor of Connecticut saying Wall Street was going to crash, because the way the question was asked, are you concerned about the ramifications? And so that really went way too far.
And so that's what inspired your column. And where'd you end up with kind of what he actually thinks about Mamdani and sort of how this is, how we're looking at this from a Connecticut lens?
What he said to me was that it was less about him worrying about the markets crashing and more about him advising Mamdani to pay attention to the very important finance industry in the way that elected officials call up and do a little backslapping and how's it going, and create an environment where they can succeed. There's nothing about democratic socialism that necessarily says that's not going to happen. And so it could help Connecticut as well as hurt Connecticut if people flee New York for Connecticut. Remember, between 6,000 and 15,000 people a year move from New York State to the state of Connecticut. And I promise you, they're not going from Buffalo to Torrington. They're going.
Shout out to Torrington, my hometown. You recently stopped in Torrington,
yes,
as
I did.
understand.
Yes,
it.
I did.
Did this come up while you were talking to people in Torrington?
It did. I was in Torrington at Sullivan Honda buying a car yesterday, of all capitalist things to do. And I had a conversation with a fellow there named Tim. Very interesting. And by the way, a great shout out to Sullivan Honda and Torrington.
Yeah.
And
would you get the car for free, Dan? Come on, get to the point.
I got the car for free. And Tim came from Albania, and so he's very concerned about this socialism. He doesn't want to see something that looks like socialism. It is
what might look like socialism to him. What things that Democratic Socialists are doing or something like that might look like scary socialism. As we say in our promo, spooky socialism.
He's a very smart and sophisticated guy, so he knows what is and what isn't socialism. But the point is, even just the label socialism creates a shiver to someone who grew up behind the Iron Curtain.
And of course, that's what a lot of people in Latin America and South America are dealing with when it comes to U.S. politics, because they think about Cuba maybe in the 1950s or something like that. And that's something that maybe the Republican Party has been able to take advantage of in terms of votes.
That's right. But people who look very closely at it know that some of the things Trump is doing also replicate authoritarianism. You have to keep in mind one thing is spreading the wealth, and the other thing is taking over.
We only got 2 minutes left. Here's how we're going to do this, because I'm going to go to you for the next 2 minutes, but it's got to be tight. And I'm going to take it back from you at some point. There's two actors I want to look at here. I want to look at the right and Ben Proto and how he might approach socialism and how he might address it. And then I want to look at a potential challenge from the left here from somebody named Josh Elliott that tells me, as he's challenging the governor, that Republicans are going to label him as socialists. So can you speak about how both sides, sort of opposite Lamont here, as more of a centrist, are kind of looking at the socialism debate here?
Yeah, I think that Ben Proto would. I haven't talked to him specifically about it. He might label Josh Elliott a socialist. I don't know. I don't want to put words in Ben's mouth. But let's talk about the ideas that are out there. Tax the rich, public supermarkets, equitable education, rent freezes, free buses, universal child care.
Ben Proto says free fares ain't free, or it's far from free, as he says.
Well, a lot of conservatives also think that
Mamdani.
free bus fares make a lot of sense to a lot of conservatives as well, for reasons that the different show. But the point is that those ideas, with the possible exception of rent freezes, which is radical, are
About
generally
30 seconds left,
mainstream liberal Democrat, not Lamont Democrat, right? For example, David Michel, he was a Democratic Socialist from Stanford. He lost his election, but he was in the legislature. He was a Democratic Socialist, right? So I think Josh Elliott would look at it and say, this is just mainstream Democratic left-wing politics, and that's really the debate. The label matters as much as the policy.
We need you to pay attention to Dan's column. You can see it at ctinsider.com because he is very nicely breaking this down for all of us. Today's show produced by Chloe Wynn. It was edited by Patrick Scahill. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Special thanks to Tess Terrible and the rest of our staff here for helping us out today. Download the Wheelhouse anytime on your favorite podcast app. I'm Frankie Graziano. This is the Wheelhouse. Thank you for listening.